Chapter 8. 4 Styles of Consciousness in the Face of Death. It is very interesting to see how, in the overheated psychic striving of vain individuals, the striking for power assumes the expression of a desire for godlikeness. Alfred Adler. Within the mass, man feels no sense of responsibility, but also no fear. Young. In the face of its thrownness, Dasein flees to the relief which comes from with the supposed freedom of the they-self, fleeing in the face of uncanniness. Heidegger. Avalanche, take me with you in your slide, Baudelaire. In his disguised drive to become divine, the immortality hunter searches unendingly for whatever means he can find to get around death. This involves manipulating his imagination to ignore nothingness or rise above it. If unable to do either, he protects himself by deliberately falling into a state of reduced or scattered being. As death waits at the finish line, we carry on with what can be distinguished as 4 lifestyles. 1. The way of standing out against the laws of creation and decay, imposing one's will on the world, dominating others or ascending over them, commanding life and someday death by talent, force, drive, or magnetism. 2. The way of retracting the self, yielding up one's being to management of others, or sharing it with others, settling for collective immortality. 3. The way of deliberately dulling one's awareness of things, drawing away from experience, seeking safety in the familiar. And 4. The way of trying to bypass death through the gentile diffusion or violent shattering of the self. Except in those rare instances, these dispositions of consciousness do not exist purely and alone in one person. Contrary approaches to life move us, and sometimes we try to follow several at once. An outlook changes or dissolves into another. The one determined to stand out from everybody else and win the approval of the imaginary gods may also, as a soldier, have known the strangely exhilarating experience of vanishing into a communion of marching men. The same consciousness may feel a marvelous alertness and a passing sense of being united with all creation, but not long afterwards sink into a round of office work and watching television at night. Granted that the states exist in us at different times, still, over the long term, one of them tends to emerge and begin dominating our affairs. If the prevailing lifestyle meets that with resistance and becomes too painful, we may shift to its opposite, or shuttle indecisively between the two. Under death's gun, every consciousness, knowingly or not, decides whether to advance or retreat. Gradually, a life plan forms. At the beginning, there will be a choice of 2 programs. The first is to stand out, reach, grasp, and try to overpower our mortal condition. The second, to shrink, yield, blend, and our transient awareness into a master plan, usually one we are unworthy to question, or entrust our destiny to the life plans of others. One impulse is to subdue the environment, the other to hide in it. One seeks immortality by dominance, the other by subservience. The first style pushes the inward individual toward achievements that show off his worthiness to be a god. The second seeks union and collective safety. But the tendencies may intermingle, in that the impulse to dominate seems often to be collective. As with stormtroopers, Red Guards, and in the late 1960s, on an international scale, the revolutionary students of the New Left, while apartness can appear to be meek, for example, in the person of a cloistered monk, this need not be contradictory. Cloistered meekness may disguise an aggressive attempt to stand out from the rest of humanity in the eyes of God, and thereby qualify for divine status, while the habit of joining crowds, even for the sake of violence, is still retractive and represents a willingness to settle for pinpoint survival in a mass of selves. Neither approach by itself can be labeled good or harmful. The one obsessed with standing out from the rest may be noble or harshly exploitive, or both. The need to blend in with others can derive from love or cowardice, affection for mankind, or fear of competition. In summary, at the four corners of unitary being, we have the God imitator, chameleon, dud, and ecstatic. Confronting life and death, some attack the obstacle course alone. Some prefer to keep their heads down and go on to the end en masse. Many fold up their awareness, retreating into a pocket of dullness and repetition. While others dissolve the unit of their own resistance so that death can never find them, using such means as liquor, drugs, madness, and multimedia bombardment. We see God imitators all around, and with God himself nearly dead, they are on the increase. The purpose of the God imitator is to subdue his environment absolutely. He intends to win divinity in the world and take it with him after death. His method being that of remorselessly imposing his presence on everyone. All within his ken must eventually yield to him, in the presence of the astral machine. In effect, he declares, as one film and television star informed his business help, "I'm King Kong, you've got to bow down to me." He will dominate either the animate or inanimate environment, and often both. He may concentrate on moving people around, controlling forces, rivers, armies, electronic systems, disease, and crime, or process the movement of money, trade, production, and all kinds of traffic. This kind of nature will plan and work ceaselessly to move you in order to get what it wants, which is the feeling of divinity now. The would-be God on earth never stops trying to incorporate the environment into himself. He simultaneously imitates and shows off to God. Overriding determination separates him from the rest of humanity. He views others through a one-way window. His project is to surround and contain their consciousness, and thereby to control life utterly so that it will not move unless he says so. Most of the time, the God imitator is sealed off from other people by a vacuum of indifference. Occasionally he may cross the space and make a brief emotional connection, but the interlude seldom lasts long. He soon feels compelled to return to his program, which allows for only the briefest emotional commitment to beings he is primarily out to manage and maneuver. The self-made deity stands ready to subdue and exploit others, but goes about it in this oddly impersonal way, since for him they hardly exist except as people of his dream. The experience of eternal separateness may be hard and lonely, but he can practically be guaranteed not to change, having decided long ago that it is better to survive alone than perish with the rest of the crowd. The God imitator puts space between himself and the rest of the world. Suspicious that the unexpected may bring death, he reduces the chance of surprise to a minimum, which means reducing the initiative of others to a minimum. Paranoia becomes his natural condition. Allen Ginsberg has said, "Because I am open, I am vulnerable. Because I am open, I am free." The God imitator can never afford this risk. He may make occasional sorties into comradeship, even joining the sweet Adeline around the bar, but distrust of his companies will always return. Behind all smiles and bursts of temper, or the facade of steely resolve, he is determined to control them absolutely, and has the deathly fear that if he does not, others will contrive to dim his star, control and reduce him, and bring to nothing his superhuman intentions. By turns, a tyrant and a benefactor, he keeps others off balance. This tactic need not be planned. More than likely it arises spontaneously from his conception of himself as being free from mortal restraints. The president of a railroad forces his associates to attend meetings, shivering at dawn, in an old circus tent. In another frame of mind, he will suddenly present a brow-beaten underling with a new Lincoln Continental or a 2-week vacation in Hawaii. A comedian humiliates his production assistant in front of a dozen others, and then a day later gives him a huge gold watch. Once in power, the most vulgar seem to have an instinct for indulging in such divine caprice. The god imitator delights in making surprise announcements that confound reasonable predictions, since to be predictable is to be mortal. Charm and kindness follow cruelty. Pain and happiness must come only through him. Beyond the display of flightiness, he tries also through his random behavior to break down the transparent wall between himself and the inhabitants of his dream, and to touch them. But brotherhood and subduing the next man cannot go together. The ambition to rise out of his species and attain a higher form of being, not only after death, but like most people, but now, today, cuts him off, sometimes intolerably, and when this happens, he lunges in the direction of humanity. For him, sudden gifts are the coin of brotherhood. They perform a dual service, at once binding and unsettling to the recipient, and at the same time allowing the imitation deity an illusion of having reached someone. The god imitator frequently exhibits childlike qualities which, depending on his or her mood, may be endearing or impossible to bear. According to Alder, understanding human nature, habits of conquest begin very early. Children do not express their striving for power openly, but hide it under the guise of charity and tenderness, and carry out their work behind a veil. Modestly, they expect to escape disclosure in this way. Every natural expression finally carries with it a hypocritical afterthought whose final purpose is the subjugation of the environment. From this proceeds the drive to power. It is the feeling of inferiority, inadequacy, insecurity which determines the goal of the individual's existence. The tendency to push into the limelight, to compel the attention of parents, makes itself felt in the first days of life. Here are found the first indications of the awakening, desire for recognition developing itself under the concomitant influence of the sense of superiority, with its purpose of attainment of a goal in which the individual is seemingly superior to his environment. Superior or inferior with respect to what? From its earliest moments, the fledgling consciousness organizes itself for survival. Once precipitated into the light, the living unit determines unceasingly to keep going. It begins as if immortal and all-powerful, and if first encounters no recognizable threat to this state, after a while it comes up against other units, bigger and stronger, with different programs that necessarily thwart its own design. These emerging forces saying no and don't and I'll hurt you seem to tower like giants, menacing existence itself. Alarm signals begin to go off in the emotional stronghold of the little self. Now, if things go well, love comes to the rescue, fondling, reassurance from somebody, lullabies of approval. The baby soul discovers that the flat hand comes down only occasionally and can be avoided, and that the bigger, stronger shapes can be affectionate too, if I do what they want. Thereafter, techniques of dealing with outside forces are refined. The self, gaining know-how, experiments with systems of challenge and appeasement and accommodates, perhaps grudgingly, the notion of others' rights. Later, probabilities of the game are learned, and what chances there may be of safely violating or changing the rules. The occurrence of injustice is painfully absorbed by the innocent in understanding, and soon the fledgling learns to operate in the world. Evidently, the child who has been loved early in the right way at the right time grows up learning to make room for another's desire. At least, he will not automatically suspect everyone of trying to reduce him. But the consciousness that makes a lifetime project of overpowering others must be that of a damaged child, deprived in some manner of early support. It is harried by the fear of being unworthy to survive. The individual proceeds with a fixed suspicion of danger. He must stand above the rest, or they will reduce him again. No one can be trusted, least of all those supposed to love you. They will be the very ones, as before, to let you drop or leave you alone in the dark. No wonder that, later on when he grows up, childlike qualities, impetuousness, changeability, and sudden cravings possess this domineering bundle of fear. Early habits of watchfulness and going his own way sharpen his understanding of others' little fashion shows before God. We often find the perceptiveness of an aggressive child in entertainers, notably comedians. The comedian forces laughter as the tragic impersonator forces tears. Both are God imitators, with the clowns usually being more aggressive. The tragic hero, or even non-hero, has a nobility about him, if only of the frustrated sort, tending to project dignity which he can take into the streets when he leaves the theatre. The comedian forces a living by making a fool of himself and of others. He is the silly prince of sadomasochism, whose dignity before God and men, worthiness to become immortal, seems always in question. In fact, he makes his mark by destroying dignity, his own or that of his foils. Entertainers, especially comedians, employ deception and childlike foolery to command the attention of the gods as well as of men. They aim to prove before as many witnesses as possible that they can bring life down around everybody else's heads by means of tears or laughter, a supremely godlike accomplishment. The comedian seduces and deceives his audiences into believing that he is life's buffoon. He and his fellow clowns and straight men are seemingly little more than butts of misfortune. The audience has the illusion of privilege, of sitting in judgment, reacting or not. But inside the clown's frame of being, members of the audience have unknowingly been corralled into his act. They belong to it, and when they laugh, belong to him. They merely serve as witnesses, while he, as one comedian bellowed at Las Vegas, "I am your emperor." Privately, the child strikes back. Comedians often exact frightful retribution for having to make fools of themselves in front of their inferiors. One entertainer capriciously left a fund raising reception in the middle of the hostess's speech, thanking him for being present, saying loudly, "I don't want to listen to that old whore." His publicity man made hurried apologies and ran after him. The press agent found his client enraged in the elevator. "You kept me waiting for 45 seconds. Never do that again." This man also said, "I create the weather in any room. I can make it storm or bright and sunny." And he is hailed for loving children and making them laugh. Intimates know his foul mouth. He curses and blasphemies to demonstrate his freedom from elementary laws of courtesy, because these are for mortals. The child court kings and queens who hold him, the god-imitating fool, in affection and esteem. They have no idea that they are characters in his game, as he is in theirs. Finally, the court fool despises every prince. If he dared, he would emulate the comic who years ago shouted across the Stork Club to a visiting nobleman, "Hey Lord, come over and meet the Ritz brothers." This is not merely chutzpah, but the envious child's unwavering project to reduce all ranks, to cut down all supposed eminence to size, and ultimately destroy it by means of laughter. The god imitator characteristically forces people to do things they don't want to do. This confirms his omnipotence. But cruelty by itself will not be the central act in his circus. It only serves the higher ambition, sadism, sexual or otherwise, demonstrates absolute manipulative control over bodies and souls. Pain is employed as a measurement of power. Sadism proves divine right. By breaking another's form against his will, one exists more, becomes more godlike. Cruelty is playing dolls with people. It also arises from the god's imitator's need to hold the environment in place. Cruelty comes from his wild fear of being nothing. If he did not feel his existence ringed with death, there would be no point in reducing others and making them cry out. Always he must keep order. The unexpected must never be allowed to arise and threaten, because then he might die. But cruelty also feeds on itself. The more order is kept, the more it must be kept. Demonstrations of power are redoubled, and still there can be no lasting satisfaction. He feels the spring of potential revolt among the injured and the humiliated coiling tighter. Rage comes, as Caligula felt it, rage over non-resistance. He grows older. Repetitions of dominance weary him, even as he grows more frantic in its exercise. Finally, he is not a god, no matter what symbolism he devises, and that this turns into the dead end of sadism. Nor can the god imitator find such relief in love. Putting oneself in another's power invites too strong a possibility of disaster. Others with their own immortality programs will surely take advantage of the defenseless soul. Who can be trusted with the god imitator's affections? Only those he subconsciously reasons who are forced to love. If, after resisting domination, such conquests submit to his power and charm, they must mean it. Now and then, the man trying to be a god is shaken by passion. He feels, in the words of Jefferson Airplane's song, as though he would burst apart and start to cry. But this is essentially narcissistic, a yearning for love which, so long as he refuses to trust anyone, he will experience only fleetingly, though often inspiring it in others. Exploiting and subduing everyone within reach to its grand design, the consciousness grasping for divinity on earth rightly fears sabotage. Paranoia, which in the beginning may be based on imaginary evidence, will sooner or later have to deal with real plots and conspiracies. A mathematics of betrayal eventually catches up with the god imitator. Often children will be the first to resist him. A son can strike back, deliberately become graceless and stupid, turn homosexual or heroin peddler. The daughter runs away with a motorcyclist or rock and roll singer, but setbacks of this kind will not significantly damage his aspirations. After all, many gods have had offspring who rebelled against them. Far more important, among those he has put in the shade, there will always be the lurking Judas, Cassius, Ego, resentful of his demigod bravura. There is no quicker way to become godlike on one's own account than to strike down someone who has strutted before the gods. The act of betrayal itself yields a passing illusion of divinity. The betrayer, saboteur, assassin of another's life plan catches the pretender's crown as it falls off, and the deed will be imprinted boldly for all time in the Olympian record. God imitation taken all the way tends almost inevitably to produce an ethic justifying murder. De Sade defends the act in these terms. Death is only a change of form, an imperceptible transition from one existence to another, which is what Pythagoras called metempsychosis. Given the assurance that the only thing we are doing is in allowing ourselves to destroy is to make a change in the form of things, but without extinguishing life, then it is beyond human power to prove that there is any crime in the so-called destruction of a creature of any age, sex, or species you can imagine. Here, wrapped in irony, we have nothing but anguish and fury because of God's disappearance, coupled with a baleful determination to replace him, in the style of Leopold and Loeb, kill precisely because we have no way of avoiding death. Go with life's animal rules. What good is compassion, since we die? Lord it over his kingdom of cheated animals. Kill before death comes. Get even with it. Top death by inflicting it. Do unto others that which someday will be done unto you. Luckily, few have the chance to play Kaluga. Most would-be gods settle for the destruction of another's name or self-esteem. The god imitator tries to reduce everyone around him, to put a stop to unauthorized movement of any kind. And since, as Faulkner said, life is motion, what the earthbound god really hopes to do is stop others from living without his permission. The chameleon trusts his consciousness to the management of others. He decided long ago that the larger shapes and forces were too formidable to take it on alone. The struggles to impress the gods intimidated him. This style of being pulls in its horns early, learns to follow the leader and aim toward collective immortality. Thereafter, the chameleon gravitates to groups and crowds. This does not necessarily mean falling into a passive state. He simply lives in a more vivid and confident way and uses his talents more effectively as a member of the group, resembling to some degree Reisman's other directed man. He may, or also may not, be one of Erich Hoffer's true believers. To describe him as a conformist tells very little. We have to go beyond inner and other direction and true believing. The business of identity is to seek life beyond death. The urge to conform may be understood as one more tactical employment of consciousness for this purpose. Seeking immortality in the mass, the poor conformist only does what he can with the impossible situation everybody faces. The tendency is to avoid death by huddling together. Martin calls it the thirst for communion. Communal experience serves another purpose besides the one of securing a man from loneliness. Blending in with the crowd, he escapes the judgment of the sky calculator. His bid for life beyond death will not be reviewed alone by itself and found wanting. So long as it stays within the group, the vulnerable consciousness is safe. The ungifted individual keeps death away through anonymity. No harm will come to him while he stays with other souls at the political rally, or at the prayer meeting, or on the peace march, in the choir or the lynch mob. Group experience also creates an effect of suspended time. Crowds live in eternity. Passively, this was true at the time of President Kennedy's violent death, and again with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. The massive loss, the stimulation's burst of grief shared by millions, caused the passing hours to hang as though suspended and to repeat themselves. Television became a communal ribbon of existence. We all turned into a crowd. There was a curious feeling of exaltation amid the horror. Together we were living more. The name of this feeling is immortality. Time can be suspended by true believing, fiercely held convictions, especially when shared within a group. Take you out of yourself and put you in another time track in which there is no aging and death. And in this sense, faith in a cause helps keep you young. In the mass, such a state can be devotional or orgastic. Either way, the ultimate goal is to pass safely through death's turnstile on the group ticket. The mass assault on immortality accounts for our latter-day worship of averages, which comfort the mediocre. Averages offer a shield against feelings of isolation and incompetence. Only a genius or a monster can be all alone on the bell graph. They provide balm and absolution for the deficient. Averages serve, too, to perpetuate a commune of mediocrity and a state of mind, the conforming part of us, named by Heidegger as the they-self. In this averageness, with which it prescribes what may be ventured, it keeps watch over everything exceptional and thrusts itself to the fore. Every kind of priority gets noiselessly suppressed. Overnight, everything that is primordial gets glossed over as something that has long been well known. Everything gained by struggle becomes just something to be manipulated. When hundreds fall into my category, I feel forgiven. The life beyond death that I may not be able to earn, not scoring impressively enough on the machine, could be within reach after all. I and my mediocre friends must simply make sure to devise rules that will prevent dangerously talented people from showing off too effectively, thus hoping to save themselves from oblivion. The ungifted invariably try to pass off averageness as a form of excellence. Most cowardly in the face of death are the duds of humanity who commit suicide on the installment plan, deliberately dulling consciousness and sinking into a round of repetition. Conquer oblivion by anesthesia. To avoid anxiety, shut out both life and death. In this slow suicide of non-being, as distinct from an attempt really to kill oneself, the despairing soul never hits bottom but floats in apathy, partly submerged, as if waterlogged. Such incomplete suicide offers no chance for renewal. The simulation of death and rebirth has not been carried all the way. An actual suicide attempt will likely be likely to envision resurrection of some kind of living on. The slow drift into non-being is part of a refusal to go down to the depths from which rebirth could be possible. We have a voluntary reduction of being without hope of renewal, a dwindling to death of the spirit before the body. The dud burrows into administrative structures or household affairs. He or she anesthetizes thoughts of death and meaninglessness by establishing for self and family, if there is one, a round of doing almost exactly the same things over and over again. The defense against nothingness, die before you die, triumph will be attainment of Topa, the unknowing hope that by remaining in this half-life without curiosity or verve, sans everything, one will slip unnoticed into whatever form of survival the authorities may provide. Hiding from death, a growing number of disenchanted people are seeking to relax and dissolve into the great oneness of being. This is often called ecstasy. In the United States, it has developed into the new ideal of pop immortality, managed in a variety of ways, all resolving down to the deliberate diffusion of consciousness. The burden of self grows too heavy. The pursuit of eternal life, to be gained by means of worldly accomplishment, seems to lead down the corridors of an endless rat maze. The gods have evaporated, leaving only an unattended labyrinth. Death may be waiting around the corner. Although jostled by others, the traveller feels unbearably exposed and all by himself. He comes to a decision that the fight for an individual survival is hopeless, and that the only way to be saved is to quickly unload one's egocentric nature. An Arab saying has it when I am present, death is not. When death is present, I am not. Living by this, to get away from the descending fist, I will make sure not to be around when death visits, not anyhow as a frightened unit of resistance. Instead, I will have gone out of myself. I will live in the timeless present, blended into the life around me. Past and future will not bother me. Oblivion will never be able to single out my unit of consciousness. The fixed self is a dying unit, having a sure prognosis of decay and sorrow by embracing the primordial. Oneness, I escape death. Primordial oneness, I escape death before it can hit me. How can the shadowy menace keep an appointment in Samara with a man whose consciousness has already been dissolved? Drifting idly on Walden Pond, Thoreau said, I cease to live and begin to be. Alone in nature, the self breaks away from the rat maze and finds its way back to Eden. There are varied means of transportation. Sports such as skiing and auto racing break through to the illusion of immortality by means of speed. Skating, sailing, riding the turf, skin and skydiving take us out of ourselves so that we become temporarily death-free. We escape death by dancing, moving into a new kind of time based on variations of our heartbeat. Bongos drum identity out of our heads. In the discotheque, the careworn self is smashed by echoing guitars and electronic shrieking, and its fragments are scattered even more finely by showering and splitting light effects. The same result will be produced by masked violins and miasmic drunkenness. The narcotic drift will take you to a space beyond time and death, as will an orgy or a church organ. All these can produce a deliberate stupefying of the intelligence. especially of one's analytical powers. Analysis itself is imagined as useless to the point of being evil. The act of separating things into categories becomes anti-life. The fact that this process has been responsible for the development, say, of smallpox vaccine and penicillin is viewed as utterly unimportant. Periodic scrambling of one's reason is useful, perhaps even necessary to enjoy the years. But for many, scrambling has become no longer a form of relief or a vacation, but the basic and most satisfying state of consciousness. The intellect has failed to deliver us from death. Worse, by stripping away illusions, the inductive pursuit of knowledge has made our forthcoming oblivion more disturbing than ever, and meaninglessness of existence more vividly clear. Therefore, the emotional reaction has been, if this is all intellect can do, abandon it. Shrinking from nothingness, the voyage falls back into the eternal now, which is the reversion to the state of a baby animal. Only the feeble, said an animal, resign themselves to final death and substitute some other desire for the longing for personal immortality. But there remains this compromise, shutting out the future and the past and living in the timeless present, and also, for example, returning to the all, the stream of energy, the river of cells, etc., from which all of us came. The transcendentalists, those who have fled the fearful self, can see themselves surviving in a stage hovering somewhere between life and death. A fantasy of Thoreau's unintentionally illuminates their cosmic Gnosticism. I used to see a large box by the railroad, 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, in which the labourers locked up their tools at night, and it suggested to me that every man who was hard pushed might get such a one for $1, and having bored a few auger holes in it to admit the air at least, get into it when it rained and at night, and hook down the lid, and so have freedom in his love, and in the soul be free. This vision of immortality offers us death with eyes. No one imagines allness without seeing. We picture ourselves bedded down somewhere, safe, breathing and watching. It is a child's vision of lying very still under the covers, peeping out through little starry holes in our blanket of being. Peering from the holes in his black box, Thoreau could feel himself absorbed into the divine intelligence. He experienced freedom in his love, inside a coffin with holes bored in it. Death and immortality merge in the transcendental imagination, which arranges a compromise. We have no fixed form, but we live on in some sort of colloidal suspension, peeking out at eternity, like a chemical solution with a drop of spirit added.